Yes, an 11th hour agreement in Washington has averted a debt default catastrophe. But the story is far from over. While the threat of a U.S. government default is off the table for now, the raising of the debt ceiling will only last until early February of next year. So we could see a repeat of all of this in the months to come. And there lies the rub. The global economy is utterly linked to the U.S. economy. Tonight, our story of the week asks, does the U.S. wield too much power over the international financial system? And joining us now for more on that, Don Brean. He's professor of finance and business economics at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. And Don, it's good to have you back on the program.
Nice to be here, Steve.
Well, the shutdown, let's just think about how significant this was. It actually cost the American economy, they estimate, about $24 billion. But this is a $17 trillion economy. So at the end of the day, was this a big deal?
Well, first of all, I'm puzzled and bewildered where Standard & Poor's got that number, how it was calculated. So I'm not even going to go there. But the thing that we should pay attention to are the costs that have been avoided. If the debt ceiling had not been raised, then the American Treasury could have been in a situation where it couldn't pay the service on its debt payments.
It would default on payments.
It would default. The U.S. has never done that, except back in 1812. They did when some people went down and burned down the White House and also burned down the Treasury, and they defaulted on their debt. So it's never happened.
I think that was us who did that.
I think it was too. But there would have been very serious economic consequences that worked through financial markets if the U.S. had defaulted on its debt. We know that in 1995 they were close to doing that, but even the fact that they didn't still worked into the capital markets, and there's a great drop in stock prices, for example, and increase in interest rates as well. So that's the one that we've avoided.
But I'm intrigued. You don't believe S&P's number, eh?
I don't believe S&P's number.
Would they be in the ballpark? I mean, the suggestion is that it wasn't that significant at the end of the day. That's what they're saying.
It's a drop in the bucket compared to a $17 trillion economy. And for them to come up with a figure like that so quickly, my sense is that they probably added up salaries of people who were not getting salaries or income, and then they summed those numbers up and said that's $24 billion.
So if they're, let's say they're right, even though you're not sure they are. $24 billion on a $17 trillion economy is not that much. However, they gave the rest of the world a heart attack in going through all this, right? So we're going to try and see what kind of an impact it had the rest of the way. The U.S. dollar, what was the impact on the buck during the course of all this?
It didn't change much in terms of its exchange rates against other currencies. If you take the currency at hand, the Canadian dollar, the U.S. dollar, it hasn't changed as a result of this.
How about other currencies around the world?
Many of them. No, the euro versus the dollar hasn't changed, and of course the dollar versus the Chinese renminbi will not change rapidly. So there hasn't been ripples through the foreign exchange markets, nor have there been great ripples through the capital markets. But nevertheless, this rather undignified spectacle in the U.S. is causing those outside of the U.S. to look on and say, we're not as confident in you as we were.
But if the numbers didn't change as much as people feared they might, does that just empower the people who were responsible for this drama to think that, well, this isn't that big a deal, we can go through this again in a few months?
I think there's something to what you say. I think they would be even more emboldened. I think that's unfortunate. I think it represents an aspect of American politics which is not healthy for the United States. And the resolution of those issues is unclear to me.
Let's talk about, with great power, as they say in Spider-Man, comes great responsibility,
yes.
And the U.S. has great power. And I wonder what you see as the role of a global reserve currency in the international monetary system today.
Well, some countries, like our own, don't need foreign exchange reserves of any significant amount. All of our adjustments that involve our currency take place through the flexible exchange rate. Other countries need to put foreign exchange reserves into their coffers. And it's just an inevitable outcome of a country running a surplus with the United States. And the United States has been running very, very large deficits. It imports much more than it exports. So therefore, the United States sends literally billions, if not trillions of dollars out into the world. They are sending out paper or little bits that represent dollars electronically, and they're getting in return automobiles and television sets and hammers, etc. But those dollars have to go somewhere. And so they go into the reserve accounts of central banks. That in itself doesn't give any power to the United States. In fact, it may give power to the countries that own the reserves. For example, China holds close to $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, about 2/3 of which are US dollars. China, if it lost its appetite for holding those US dollars, would impose a great deal of trouble for the world, because you would see US interest rates rising, the US currency falling. And so the power doesn't necessarily reside with the United States, even though it's US dollars that we're talking about.
What role does the U.S. have, though, as the globe's reserve currency in the way you just described it?
Well, the expression has been used that it's an exorbitant privilege to be the country that is the custodian of the world's most important foreign reserve currency. For the U.S., it means that it captures what's known as seigniorage. When it sends its dollars abroad, which are only little bits of paper, it actually gets real things in return, and that's an exorbitant privilege. But what it really does, it means that the U.S. can very easily borrow abroad, because there is, the world is awash in U.S. dollars. People don't want the dollars, they want securities that generate interest. Those securities are U.S. Treasury bills, and so it allows the United States to sell its debt to the rest of the world with an ease that no other country can do.
Can you imagine any other country's currency in the world, or group of countries, I guess, with the EU, supplanting the U.S. dollar as the global reserve?
Well, the U.S. dollar supplanted British sterling about 120 years ago. The EU's currency, the euro, is moving up in importance in the foreign exchange accounts or the reserve accounts of banks around the world. And even China's renminbi, which is not a convertible currency, is being held as a reserve in some places like Malaysia, for example. So, but to answer your question directly, no, there may be a transition over the next many decades to see the relative importance of the dollar decline as the reserve currency. But still, it holds pride of place right now.
It holds pride of place. Do you think it should continue to do so?
It's not something that gives the U.S. any direct power over other nations. I don't think it's a power issue that we're dealing with, and it doesn't concern me. No, I see it more as an accounting issue, because if one country runs deficits, as the U.S. has done, trade deficits, other countries must run surpluses, and they have to accumulate these dollars. They have to be outside of the United States. So I don't see it as much more than simply an accounting issue.
Well, okay, an accounting issue, but a point of pride for Americans?
Oh, indeed. Oh, yes. It is.
Does that count for something?
Oh, that counts for something, and also the exorbitant privilege, the fact that they can raise money easily around the world. What does concern me is the imbalance, the extent that U.S. foreign debt becomes very large, so much larger than they can handle. A lot of the debt that they have, the government, is actually owed to themselves, but their foreigners do hold a lot of U.S. debt. Now, if the U.S. sees this happening and thinks that its own indebtedness is too great, again, the exorbitant privilege allows the U.S. the opportunity of increasing its inflation, which erodes the value of the debt outside and it pushes the costs of U.S. adjustment onto foreigners.
Not to mention creates a spiral of a whole lot of other spin-offs, like people start demanding higher wage settlements and all of that in order to keep up.
Exactly, but I think that the most important point is, as far as we can see, there is no inflation on the horizon.
Right.
And that's a peculiar thing, given the amount of money that is being produced in the United States.
I'm going to read you a comment here from Jose Antonio Elcampo, who's the former Minister of Finance in Colombia, as you know, writing about the showdown over the debt ceiling that has been sort of transfixing Washington over the last few weeks. He writes, "The ongoing political stalemate in the United States holds two major implications for the international monetary system. The better-known consequence has been deepening uncertainty about the U.S. dollar, the main global reserve currency, and U.S. Treasury securities, supposedly the world's safest financial asset. Simply put, the global economy has at its center a dysfunctional political regime that generates recurrent threats of default on the world's major reserve asset. The latest episode makes it abundantly clear that our globalized world deserves a better international monetary system than the current non-system that evolved in an ad hoc manner after the collapse in the early 1970s of the initial Bretton Woods arrangements. What do you think of what he's got to say here?
Well, Jose is a very wise fellow and experienced in this. His point, similar to the one we made a few minutes ago, is that there is increased uncertainty about how the U.S. is managing its fiscal affairs and its monetary affairs. And this leaves other countries worried, because if they're holding U.S. treasuries and those interest rates go up, as I say, the value of those treasuries go down. I would question the recommended alternative, which would be to move to a Bretton Woods style system of fixed exchange rates, because those are virtually unmanageable. The degree of economic integration in the world and financial integration in the world makes for very, very sudden financial crises, as we experienced so much through the 50s and the 60s. Now, the U.S. was, to some extent, the creator of those problems, because it was the creator of much of the global inflation at the time. But nevertheless, the frequency and the extent of the financial crises where the International Monetary Fund would have to come in and somehow guide fixed exchange rates to an equilibrium level was an impossible task. So when the world moved to flexible exchange rates in the early 1970s, I think the world was a better place. I think that flexibility works to the advantage of all nations.
So it makes no sense to reimpose an inflexibility in the financial architecture of the world.
Right. And an example of that, which is beset by political issues, is the euro itself. Now, the euro is going to last. The integrity of the euro is there because of the political commitment of the major players in Europe. But often, even the development of the euro was done by the European elites, especially in France and Germany. Now, but what's happening in the euro is the fixed exchange rates, for example, played very much into the hands of Germans. It made their advantage in industry all the stronger, as they could export without foreign currency exposure. But the strains that you see within the euro are being withstood by the Europeans. But in a global economy, many other nations couldn't possibly do that.
But Senor Elcampo seems to be suggesting here that the international monetary system, I don't know if it needs an overhaul, but it needs a bit of reform, doesn't it?
Well, as we call it, the international financial architecture or international financial plumbing has been leaky over the past number of years. But one of the things that has happened over, again, the past number of years is that inflation has gone. And so much of the kinds of problems that are associated with a leaky international financial system is when you have unpredictable and high levels of inflation. That's what causes great volatility in exchange rates. Now, Mr. Campo, for example, is of a group of people who think that the United States is imposing risks on other countries as the United States deals with its own internal problems. And the big example of that happened a few months ago when the Federal Reserve Governor, Ben Bernanke, made a public announcement that seemed to indicate that the U.S. was going to taper, was going to slow down the very aggressive monetary policy that it had. That then led to a virtual tsunami of currencies coming from developing countries such as India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, into the United States as people wanted to buy currencies, wanted to buy U.S. securities that would have higher interest rates. That caused a very sharp decline in the exchange rates of the countries that I've mentioned, and a few others, including Brazil, that caused them great difficulty.
Would you like to have the power of being able to say 10 words and have the major financial players of the world change their behavior based on what you say?
Well, but then 3 or 4 days later, Mr. Bernanke had to reverse that position publicly. Yes. And of course, then there was the reversal of funds.
Had to tell everybody to chill.
Yeah.
Is it good for the global economy to be so utterly dependent on one currency, namely the American greenback?
I really don't know whether it's good or bad. I think that there are some advantages when you have one currency in which many important commodities are denominated, oil, for example. I think that gives a certain stability to the pricing system of internationally traded commodities. I think that there's something to be said when the system is working well to have financial assets denominated in dollars and having many of those being traded internationally so that people have reference points, have benchmarks to deal with, because they'll say that's the US interest rate. If that's the US interest rate, if that's the interest rate on the most liquid and most secure financial asset in the world, that's a good thing, even if you're outside of the United States.
Do you think it behooves American policymakers to behave more responsibly given the impact it potentially has on the rest of the world's economy and currencies?
Yeah, as I say, that was an undignified spectacle that the world was forced to see over the past few weeks.
Who do you blame?
Well, there's a dysfunction in the political system. I mean, the extreme right wing, the Tea Party, as it were, of the Republican Party, was a very vocal voice in all of this, and I think they worked to cause a split within their own party.
A responsible vocal voice?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they're an unreasonable one too. I think their mission was to defund the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and I think that's, as John McCain said, that's a fool's errand. I mean, to take the centerpiece of the legacy that President Obama has created and the Democratic Party has established, and to expect them to dismantle that.
Particularly after the Supreme Court has endorsed it.
Yes, John Robertson's Supreme Court has endorsed it, yes. That it was a different kind of politics being played.
We got 20 seconds left here for me to ask you. They didn't solve this, obviously. They put it off till February. Are we going through this all over again in a few months?
I'm afraid so. I think the lingering problem here, and the one that we don't know the solution to because the solution is political, is to how to deal with the continuing of the challenge of funding the budget. Now, you know, I mean, the debt ceiling has been around since 1917. The debt ceiling has been raised over 100 times over the last 100 years and 15 times over the past 10 years. And that's just a matter of course.
They're the only country who does this anymore.
Well,
though.
except for Denmark.
And Denmark, okay.
Yes, but it's a rather strange system, but it's entirely consistent with the broad set of checks and balances that the U.S. has in place.
The solution is simple. You have to get rid of their form of government and impose a Canadian parliamentary system.
There you go.
And the world would be sane. Thanks so much, Don Brean from the Rotman School of Management at U of T. Good to see you again here.
Good to see you, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.